Warwick Gately is the recently appointed Victorian Electoral Commissioner. And Warwick, you've been in the role for 6 months? Is it roughly 6 months? 4 months. 4 months. That's important because the Electoral Commission did a comprehensive report, if you like, of the last 2012 council elections. Councillor Geoff is with us today. Monash councillor, former mayor, ex-president of the MAV and ex-president of the ALGA. Mike Berwick, former mayor, Douglas Shire in Queensland, to bring your knowledge. Thanks for coming down, making the trip. Councillor Jieh from Monash Council and Policy Officer at the VLGA. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Maryantonett, our presenter from the first session, our special guest from Canada. Thank you for coming along. And she's suffering jet lag. She woke up at 3 o'clock the night before last, and last night she woke up at 1:15. Hasn't been back to sleep since, so she might be feeling it by the end of the day. So welcome, Maryantonett. Now, I'm about to ask the panellists, and I'll give you a couple of minutes each, up to 5 minutes perhaps, to actually answer the question based on the information that we've seen this morning and your relevant expertise in the positions that you hold in relation to the question, is the local government electoral system still working? And that, I'm going to kick off with Warwick from the Victorian Electoral Commission. Warwick, as you know, Victorian local governments, 70 to 79 have postal voting, 9 have attendance voting. Is it still working, in general terms?
Gavin, thank you very much. I must come at this from the perspective of an independent electoral authority, and the VEC has a long history of working with councils on elections and have been the only provider since 2003. And of course the VEC is engaged on a commercial basis to run these elections, be they attendance or be they in postal. Council elections are complex, probably more complex than a state election. For example, in the 2012 elections, there were 273 council elections, whereas in a state election there's 96 for the districts and the regions. Local government elections, there were 2,004 candidates. In a state election there's 711, roughly. Local government elections, 631 vacancies versus 128 vacancies in the state setting. So it is complex. It's principally done by post. In 2012, just under 3.3 million postal voting packages were distributed across the state. Is it working? Yes, it's working, absolutely. The elector is at the heart of the system. The elector has the opportunity to vote, be it attendance or be it postal. And the elector can have confidence in the system, its transparency and its integrity. The elector also has, in my opinion, all the necessary information to make an informed decision. And there's some of the matters that perhaps we're going to talk about further this morning. But like all voting systems, every now and then you've got to have a look at it. Does it need fine-tuning? Does it need an adjustment? But you don't make wholesale changes. So in my opinion, the local government electoral system is still working.
Thanks, Warwick. It's interesting to note Warwick quoted some figures there. 613 councillors that are presently elected across the state. In the 2012 council elections, there was in actual fact 2,004 individuals who nominated for those positions. One of them passed away and 3 withdrew their nominations by the time of actually the close of nominations. So we had 2,000 candidates going into the last round of council elections. By contrast, if you look at this coming federal election on Saturday, the Australian Electoral Commission was crowing about the fact that nationally they have 1,717 candidates standing for election at the federal at the coming election this weekend. So I think the appetite is still there. Councillor Yildiz.
Thanks, Devon. Certainly from my perspective as a city council in the city of Monash, and as a bit of a policy wonk who looks at this space in my day job at the VLGA, from a general perspective, I agree with Warwick. It is working, but like every other system and format, it does require a review here and there. I'm pleased to say that I support the Victorian Government's review of the 2012 elections, and based on what the Minister has said, the first ever review of the election process. I might be wrong, but that's what she has said. But overall, I think local government should be taking responsibility in this review, not the state government. Local government should be dictating how the review should be and also what areas we should be looking at. As I said before, generally I do support the system in place. The electors are, in my view, informed and are able to make decisions based on the information provided. But there are areas, in my view, that I believe should be looked at, and that is around candidate diversity. How do we encourage more candidates from different backgrounds to stand for elections? Namely people from multicultural backgrounds, young people, women, people with disabilities. How do we encourage other groups to stand for election and understand the value of local government? We also need to look at participation as well, and it's a bit disappointing that the voter turnout in 2012 dropped quite steadily. For instance, you're looking at attendance elections. At 2008 it was 70%, in 2012 it was 63%. So 7% may not be a large number, but in my view, a lot of people haven't had are not having their say in who should be governing their council. So there are a bit of areas that needs improvement on and further discussion. But overall, in my view, it is working.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mike.
Yes, thanks for having me. I think it's ironic that we're talking about government 3 days before the federal elections, by which time all principles of good government seem to be thrown out the window by our peers. And following from that, I believe it's difficult to reform local government when we have such a dysfunctional system of government nationally. And personally, I prefer something like New Zealand, where you have federal, regional and local, hopefully one day, but of course you can't wait. So local government does need to reform itself, and maybe we can have a grassroots trickle-up effect to reform generally. And I do think when you talk about these things, you do need to look at the big picture and see where you fit in it. But my suggestion for the day is a bigger focus on participatory government than representative, democracy, should I say, participatory democracy rather than representative democracy. And my apologies for speaking about another session which is on this subject, but I find it difficult to talk about the electoral system without looking at that. And I think what that means for us is a much greater focus on the community, corporate, land use plans and policies that local governments have. And probably a shift also towards more of a skills-based council than purely a representative one. And then the question would be how you get there. Because I look at commercial boards and see the benefits of skills-based boards, but of course in local governmental democracy you need a much wider range of skills. I think that predicting how a council is going to go when they actually get in there is a very difficult thing to do. I've seen people that look great and perform badly, and people that don't look good and perform wonderfully well. It's nearly as hard as choosing a CEO. However, if you did have a bit more of a focus on policies, plans, budgets and the like in the lead up to an election, we might get a bit more informed debate from the people that are standing, instead of this sort of personality popularity contest which I think is one of our problems. I come from a little rural shire, and one of the first things to say, well, I don't know him, who's he? Well, I agree with what Phil said, you shouldn't have to know them. They should keep down to their 10 hours a week and be properly paid. I think those things are very fundamental, and it should be the organisation that does the community engagement, and of course fundamental to this participatory form of democracy is a much stronger form of community engagement. So I'd suggest one way we might implement this, because it's all very well to talk about these things, but you need a way to actually make it happen, is for a few reformist councils to start thinking about succession strategies. So we've got a council election coming up. Obviously the staff, the organisation would need some instructions from council, but start getting those policies out there and putting the new candidates in a position where they actually have to read the council plans and policies and statutes and all of those sorts of things, and you can say to them, well, do you like it, don't you like it, do you want to change it, and hopefully have a much more informed debate in the lead up to an election than our current sort of popularity context that we get at the moment.
Fantastic, thanks Mike. Councillor Lake.
Thanks Gavin, and I'm sure there's a few people here who thinks it's a bit ironic that I'm on a panel three days out from the federal election talking about good governance, but thank you to the MAV for including me on the panel. I think I've been a councillor for a bit over 13 years, and I think right through that period there's been discussion around whether the electoral system that we have in local government, and I guess most of us will be most familiar with Victoria. I know there's a few people from interstate and some people from overseas, but from my experience as a participant in the Victorian electoral system, I think by and large, and although there are some exceptions, the electoral system in most circumstances has thrown up probably the candidates who most deserve to be elected. Now, we can all think of examples where that's probably not true, but electoral processes are competitive and they're hard. In metropolitan councils in Victoria these days, with the size of our wards, particularly where we have multi-member wards, the electorate that you're campaigning in is essentially the size of about a state electorate. So it's not surprising that to be elected, in most cases, you need to spend some money. And it's the candidates that go to the effort of putting things into letterboxes, being out, meeting voters, door knocking, all of those sorts of things that perhaps we associate with federal and state elections, and some people associate less with local elections. I think it's those things that make all the difference. And particularly in multi-member wards where there's a number of candidates, preferences are crucial, and the arrangements that you do, the deals that you do with other candidates will impact a lot on who's ultimately elected and who's not elected. And I think, based on the way I see it, that more times than not, the candidates who maybe are not the most qualified, often they are, but sometimes they're not, but the ones who get elected are the ones that have actually worked the hardest, who have spent the most money, who have campaigned, who have knocked on the most doors, and I think that's a good thing, because local government's unique to the other levels of government. Like when people vote on Saturday, you're going to vote for you're going to vote for the Labor Party because you like Kevin Rudd, or you're going to vote for the Liberal Party because you like Tony Abbott, or you're not going to vote for either of them and choose one of the other minor party candidates because you don't like either of them. But you're voting on a brand that we all know well because we live with it every day, what we read about in our papers. It's very different at the local level because there's not the same party branding. You're voting for people that you don't know, that based on, for those of you who vote in postal ballot election, based on the blurbs that you read, and for those of you who turn up to vote in an attendance ballot, based on the material that you're given and that you've received in the lead up to the election. And so, that makes it a very different proposition and probably a less informed electorate that, has to be overcome by vigorous campaigning, door knocking, and putting things in letterbox by candidates at the local level.
Thanks, Geoff. Maryantonett.
Thank you, Gavin. In order to deal with the question, is local government electoral system still working, my question is, what is it producing? And are citizens happy and satisfied with what it's producing? So to unpack that, let me go back to something Phil said. Phil said governance is a post-war relic. And he asked about which war, and I'm going to say the Boer War, but I'd actually say the 7 Years' War, which if you're not a historian, you got to go back to the 18th century. There are some models here that just don't align anymore to what citizens expect these days, and they are that far back. And therefore, there's an imperfect fit for a whole bunch of reasons. So let me just give you a sense of my perspective from away. Democracy is imperfect. It gives us the best, or it gives us those most stable of the bunch who are running. A lot of people, as I was chatting outside discussions yesterday and in the tea break there, were talking to me about, is compulsory voting a good thing? Because not everybody's knowledgeable who's voting. Well, if I was Queen for a day, and Queens still make decisions in some places, I think compulsory voting happens to be great because I come from a country where it's rare that 40% of the population actually shows up to vote in local elections. And these are huge in urban areas, huge complex governments that have as important a role, except for maybe security and defense, as any level of government that actually touches me as a Canadian citizen. So there's a lot to be said for having people show up. Now, in terms of the model I'm most used to, we don't have party branding because the concept is, and I think it's a more collaborative concept that lends itself to modern day and to evolving notions of governance, the mayor is the first amongst equals. It's a consensus-based model typically that allows a mayor through leadership and through leadership of councillors to bring a community to a certain direction in a certain place. So there are models in the UK, of course, where there is party branding. In Canada, we don't have it, and when I watch the combination of things working, I'd say it's not necessarily the right time to lock into party branding at the local level because that model should evolve dramatically before kinds of those decisions are made. So where else would I go? I would go to the question of, are the best people actually running for the job? There's no question that the best or most able in an election are the ones who get elected. There's no question. That's what democracy is supposed to give us, right? But the questions we were unpacking earlier today is, are the best people actually running for the job? Well, government's become an awful place to be with lots of blame game and always looking for who's responsible for something that goes wrong. One of the things we have to do if we believe that we can aid and abet either a full-scale reform or just improvement of our electoral systems is we should be much more open about championing the work of government and local government in particular, because if we don't champion it and we allow those who want to play the blame game in the media, but even amongst ourselves sometimes, to play that game, we're constantly cutting off the pool of people who think of running. And some of those are tremendous people who will not subject themselves to the kinds of things that elected office now brings you, whether at the local level, the state level, or the national level. The next thing I'd say is, to an informed audience like this one is, for heaven's sakes, participate in your own reforms. Do not allow other levels of government who actually have, in theory, or not in theory, they have the legal authority, but you have as much moral authority to determine what works for your communities and what it's going to take. And reform is a sport that's best engaged when you're actually working towards it and not having other people do it to you. So are the best running? I think that's a live question, given the state of government these days and the blame game that goes with it. The next place I'd go to is knowledge. Who runs? How informed are they? How informed do they need to be? Well, this notion of building capacity, of constantly professionalizing the notion of political leadership, I think is a very important one to helping to restore some of those connections and trusts that people have in government. So building capacity, the professionalization, the roles that institutions and organizations like MAV can play once people are elected, to helping them understand what the appropriate roles for councillors are, what the appropriate roles for senior staff are. The ability for organizations like MAV, and I'm not suggesting it has to be MAV, but for organizations like MAV to help local councils in understanding benchmarking. So an organization like MAV can step a little above the fray and set the normative targets for what should be happening in terms of some of these reforms and how they should play out. Because not everybody has the time, the professional knowledge, or the ability to engage in this education professionalization. So I think that's fundamentally important. And then the last thing I would say in this reform of the electoral system, I don't think we've seen the end to the trend in consolidation. I, quite frankly, am surprised at there were earlier attempts at consolidation, and they seem to have stopped, but I think those pressures are going to continue at some rapid pace as the cost cutting that I spoke about earlier continues, but also because with those economies of scale come the ability to better representation, to more professionalization, to a better understanding of what local economies and local societies will want to achieve. And quite frankly, at that level, I also see that in Canada, for example, we've gone through consolidations that have given us not only the federal, the state level. Before people tackled consolidation locally, we created a different level of government that doesn't kind of exist anymore. We went to a regional level where, because consolidation was politically impossible to contemplate at some point, for the larger metropolitan districts and for some of the larger rural districts as well, the provincial level of government started to appoint professional, often politicians, but who had professionalized public service bent, if you understand what I mean by the competencies, to be the regional champions, like mayors, holding office and making the actually financially more important decisions, which kind of undermines representative government. So I think you have an opportunity to both continue the effort to consolidation and aggregation, which gives you better outcomes in terms of what the system is producing, but make it directly responsive to the electoral system. Because the importance, if you're continuing to consolidate, is not to disenfranchise voters who do want to have a role and have to have a role in what's going on. So, and the challenge of that electoral system should be to understand how to appropriately reflect the increasingly important role of local government, because that trend is not going to go away. And if I had to look into the future, which I often do, because I don't have to have the day jobs these folks do, I can turn myself into a futurist and look to that domain. I would say that while it might feel like the local level of government is the one under the most pressure to make changes and so on and so forth, I think the one at the greatest risk, notwithstanding our constitutions, Australia's being like Canada's that way, the real level of government that's going to feel pressure at the risk of everything else that we're talking about is the state level. Because a citizen looking up can't see the reason for three. They might see the reason for one at the top in terms of security, defense, and other kinds of national kinds of issues that they feel are important to be represented and to be heard on. But the trend around the globe is the importance of local, the feeling of local, the sense of place and the belonging of community. So I think over time, as I spoke of this morning in the Canadian context, where more and more services may not be constitutionally housed in the local level of government, but are migrating there in terms of delivery, the electoral system has to align with that. So I think those are your challenges. And let's not go back to the 7 Years' War in the 18th century for a model of governance that works for today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maryantonett. Just a quick question. Is local government recognised in the Canadian Constitution?
No, it's not. It's a creature of the provincial level of government, your state level.
Okay. Thank you very much. John Benning joined us came a bit late. That's great, John. We're actually thinking of you as a pilot council to have at your council meetings where there's no council officers, just have the councillors in charge without any bureaucrats or anything like that. So fantastic, great you could join us, and we look forward to the outcome of that pilot. Good on you. Anne Murphy is also over here, and Anne is an important lady, and she's on the state government's review of the electoral process. And Sally as well. Thank you for both joining us. And their brief, amongst other things, as reported in the press release, was to look at, do we have too many dummy candidates, and political disclosure if you're a member of the political party who actually stand for office.
I resemble that remark. No candidate is a dummy.
No, that's right. That's right. Exactly. Dummy candidates. Donkey candidates, perhaps, might be another interpretation.
Or a donkey, for that matter.
That's right. Just very quickly, then we're going to open it up to the audience. Just very quickly from the panellists here. We've said what are the good things, what are the some of the bad things. If there was one thing you could each do, to improve the system as it is, what would it be? But before we do that, Warwick, the interpretation of compulsory voting, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, was that voting is compulsory in council elections unless you're over 70, where you won't be issued with a notice of fine. Is that right? That's correct, yep. Okay, good. Okay, so if there's one thing, just very quickly from all the panels before we open it up to discussion, there's a lot on as for the presentations. What is the one major thing in your respective areas that you could, inject into the system to improve it or change? Warwick.
Gavin, with respect to process, there's nothing that comes immediately to mind. My energy and effort, if I could change any one thing, would be to better engage the community so they have an understanding of their civic duty and responsibility, not only with respect to local government, but their engagement in politics and voting generally, be it getting themselves on the roll, be it keep their enrolment up to date, turning out today and voting for.
Thank you. Councillor Logan.
Similar along those lines, Gavin, but with all due respect to the VEC, I actually believe that local councils themselves should be doing a bit more at promoting the role of local government as well as the importance of elections. I think we rely too much on the VEC's statewide communications plan around communicating the importance of elections to the community. Councils themselves don't actually do it enough. I mean, it's hard for me to generalise that because some councils do it, some councils don't, but I strongly believe that as representatives elected by the community, but also the council itself providing services to the community, we have a big role to encourage voters to turn up to vote.
Thank you. Mike?
Yes, I'd like to follow up with this consolidation stuff that Maryantonett's mentioned. I come from a shire that was amalgamated in 2008 and has just been de-amalgamated. And elections coming up shortly. I'm not standing. I'm not against amalgamations, and I think I'm not against big councils. Brisbane City, for example, is it's got a budget twice the size of Tasmania, and I think there are many ways in which it functions quite well. So it's not a totally anti thing. But what I have seen is where amalgamations, as in my case, didn't bring any of the benefits that it was meant to. We weren't two councils with merging suburbs, we were miles apart, and the community revolted, and I think with good reason. And I come down here, I've got two daughters in Melbourne, they're relatively politically aware. I've sat around parties with all of their friends, and half of them don't know which council they're in anymore. The councils have lost their identities, and they have no faith in councils. They see it's completely outside their control. So I think you need a community of interest to have a successful council. So I think really if we're going to deal with this issue of consolidation, and I think we absolutely have to because of what Maryantonett said, is that we're not going to be able to deal with it successfully until we do something more dramatic, like removing the states. And I agree with you, they're the superfluous level of government. The feds and the state have agencies that all do the same. Who knows? Health, environment, education, transport. Who knows where the state responsibility and the federal responsibility lies? It's a great opportunity for cost shifting, blame shifting, and inaction. And that's why I advocate the New Zealand system. They didn't have a written constitution, so they could change their arrangement by a vote of parliament. Right. And so they brought in the system. And you do have regional governments that deal with regional issues like water supplies or regional roads, local governments with potholes and the local street and the speed bumps, and federal government foreign policy and those big issues. And I think the consolidation, amalgamation issue will not be solved by this mindless amalgamation approach when the real issue is not being solved. And maybe local government can drive this. And I think that concept of re-looking at things, and it may never happen because it's so difficult to change the constitution, but unless you do that, you're not going to solve this consolidation issue.
Thanks, Mike. Geoff.
Just sticking with the consolidation comments, I agree with Mike that any discussion around amalgamations has to be based around communities of interest. And my personal view is in Victoria, in rural and regional areas, council boundaries I think, are about right. There might be some need to tinker around the edges, but by and large, I think the size is right, and I think most of the boundaries are pretty well right. I think there perhaps is a case, though, in metropolitan areas around a discussion beginning around whether we still need 31 councils to cover Melbourne. In Brisbane, you know, if you were to follow their model, we'd have one, or we'd have one and maybe, you know, 3 or 4 around the edges. And I think that is a discussion worth having here. I don't agree with the argument that 3 levels of government in Australia is too many and that therefore we need to get rid of the states. Even if that was a view that everyone supported, I don't think it would ever happen, because all it requires is one state to vote no at a referendum, and I believe it can't happen, or at least it can't happen in that state, because they've got the same sovereign right as the Commonwealth does to have their government continuing to exist. I think the key, though, lies to the responsibilities between the levels of government. There's no doubt that there can be improvements in who's responsible for what, and the key to resolving those issues is around revenue and around taxation, who collects what, and trying as much as possible to match revenue-raising ability with functions and spending responsibility. And our problems that we experience in Australia between the 3 levels of government, I think, come from the fact that the Commonwealth collects almost all of the taxation revenue, and the states collect very little, but are responsible for funding the most significant, you know, service costs. And that's where we have this imbalance between accountability, financing, and management of the system.
Thanks, Geoff. Maryantonett, just very quickly, and then Oscar, thanks for coming. I know you're late, and everyone knows your story, so thanks for making it. But if you can have a think about, is the local government electoral system still working? That's your question. We'll come to you after Maryantonett, then we'll open it up to the floor. Maryantonett, just very quickly. Yeah,
if I only have one thing to say, I'm going to echo what Warwick said earlier. I think that the more people know and the more people are informed about what goes on, they'll take their future into their own hands. So I think you need the champions for local government, and understanding what's important and what the skills are that you need to have to run should be the people who are currently there, talking up the importance of elections, talking up the importance of making informed choices, and talking up the importance of the capacity that local councillors need to have in order to be elected.
Thanks, Maryantonett.
I haven't had much time to think about it, Gavin, but I think yes, it is working. Personally, my own experience in terms of dealing with the electoral system, it has. It's been quite accountable, quite responsible. But further to what Geoff said, I think the 3 tiers of government is important. I think the local government being the closest to the people, of course. And I think there's things that we can do that certainly the state government can't, and or the federal government. So absolutely, I think the 3 tiers of government is quite effective. But personally, I haven't had any issues with the electoral system myself, and I don't think as a council we have either. So we've had a fairly good relationship. Even though there may be some questions raised as to how our last election went, I think in general it was well run, and certainly the results show that they were quite effective in the way that we ended up with the councils we're with now.
Thanks, Oscar. Oscar, you're from a council that has attendance voting. Geoff and Councillor Lowe are from a council that has postal voting. What are your thoughts on, to the 3 of you? What are your thoughts? What's the best one? What increases participation? You know, we've heard today that, you know, it's a fairly sanguine sort of process to go through for postal voting. You've got 150 words, you've got a nice photo. Donald Duck could possibly win. Other than, you know, the attendance voting where, through name recognition. Other than the attendance voting where you've got to get out, you've got to get the volunteers to man your polling booths, to do your pre-poll voting, to follow up the postal voters, all that sort of stuff.
I think the thing with attendance voting, I think, is the positive is the fact that you've got to do door knocking. I know you do. You certainly have to do that with postal as well. But I've door knocked almost 5,000 residents last year, and a lot of them said, "Hey, I didn't realise that the sort of person you are." When you start talking to them, and they've got the opportunity to actually ask you questions, so then and there. we are one of the only councils that in fact does that. I did vote for postal voting. I think it saves the council a lot of money. In fact, it was going to save us just over $100,000 if we did take up the postal voting. But I think it gives the voters a bit more of an opportunity to understand who you are. But then again, with attendance, they get, so with the postal voting, they get to sit there in their lounge room and they've got all the candidates, you know, there, and they can read through all their material and make a decision. But I think attendance voting has been around for a long time. I don't want to say this, but I think we will probably go down the path of doing postal. But I think because of the fact that we're inconveniencing all these people to come out on a Saturday, and it does make it hard, especially if the conditions aren't right. You've got rain, you've got the weather conditions can have an impact. And if you look at the number of people that don't vote, attendance voting compared to postal, it's actually a little bit higher because people can't be bothered. And just driving in this morning to hospital, I heard on 3AW they're saying that a guy raised the question, how many people in fact have been punished for not voting attendance, and how many of them in fact were handed down the fine and paid for it. So my personal opinion is I think we need to go down the path of postal, but attendance voting has its advantages, and one of them is the fact that it gives the voters the opportunity to see you in person, and you also shed a lot of bloody kilos. So we lost about 9 of those during the election last year. So, yeah.
So to be fair to say that the councillors from postal voting councils are overweight. Geoff and Councillor Lowe, just very quickly, then we'll open up to discussion from the floor.
Well, I mean, the arguments for postal voting over attendance voting seem pretty clear cut. It's cheaper, more people prefer it, and it has significantly higher participation rates than attendance voting. My view is where the councils that have attendance voting, they have it because it is an electoral advantage for some part of that council that's made that decision. Generally, the Labor Party or progressive politics is benefited by attendance voting. The theory is that, you know, where you've got high levels of non-English speaking people, you're going to get a much stronger vote and a more progressive vote if you get them to turn up and physically give them a how to vote card rather than send them something that's quite complicated, got 4 or 5 things to it in an envelope through the mail. And it's no surprise when you look at, is it the 8 councils that have attendance voting? All of those make absolute sense when you think about which ones is there an advantage to this particular group through having attendance voting, with one exception, and it's a unique one, and I know there's at least one Glen Ira council here, but it's Glen Ira, which, you know, is not a Labor council. It's always intrigued me why Glen Ira has attendance voting, and particularly when you think Glen Ira is home to, you know, such a large Jewish community as well who live around Caulfield. You'd think, well, if there's any council that would embrace postal voting, why not Glen Ira? Glen Ira is maybe it's the thing that proves the rule, because I don't know why Glen Ira is attendance voting, but all of the other ones make perfect sense because there's an advantage basically to the Labor Party in continuing to have attendance voting.
Fantastic. Councillor Lowe.
Well, I would echo what my esteemed colleague, my councillor colleague said before in his opening statements in relation to postal voting. It's actually very hard to win an election on postal voting. You know, you don't have the advantage of, you know, I guess that sort of large volunteer base and all those resources to be able to present to do all your policies and your ideas. Just a bit of personal experience for me. I haven't had much experience with attendance voting, so I'd like to share some things that I did for postal voting. I spent about $12,000, $13,000 on both of my campaigns in 2008 and 2012. But that wasn't only materials, also a vast amount of letterboxing and door knocking with friends and family across the ward. And I've got a ward where there's about 26,000 electors, which is pretty much the same size as the state electorate, expanding from about 6 or 7 suburbs within the ward. And you know, just to spend all that time, you know, taking out a month off work without pay during the first time in 2008, and spending pretty much my fiance's engagement ring money. So taking a gamble on that and should be furious about getting elected. So, but you know, I think it's about how the candidate sort of plans out his or her campaign. I think I sent out 4 or 5 different letters. I had a Chinese letter, a Greek letter, an Italian letter, all sent out during the election process. Door knocked about 200, 300 houses a day. Letterbox. My father nearly collapsed off heat stroke, you know, and you know, you put a lot of effort as well in post. I don't think people generally don't understand that. It is hard, as Geoff said before, for local government elections because you're not voting for the party, you're voting for the individual. You're asking for, you know, you're asking an individual to put their confidence in someone they probably never have met. I don't agree that in relation to comments around the 150-word statement and the glamorous photo shared by Phil before on the screen, you know, it is a way of informing voters, but I think it's again up to the candidate and how much information they put out, how much time they invest into his or her campaign, and you know, as the numbers have proven, in terms of voter participation, postal voting is generally much higher than attendance voting, especially for non-English speaking backgrounds, young people, etc. They like to have the luxury of voting at home, to have the opportunity to decide over a period of time. You know, they get the ballot paper 2 weeks before election day. They have that opportunity to find out a bit more about the candidates, and they can do it at the luxury of their own home. So I think, from my experience, I don't have an issue with postal voting at all. But in fact, you know, having a look at some of the statistics at the Victorian state and federal government level, early postal voting is actually on the increase. People prefer to get their ballot papers posted to them.
Or pre-poll voting.
Pre-poll, yeah, rather than standing in front of a line on a cold or hot Saturday morning. So, yeah, I'm a big supporter of postal voting.
Fantastic. Warwick, just very quickly, is there much appetite from the other levels of government to embrace postal voting that you're aware of?
Gavin, no. The voting services that are provided will stay much as they are. I'll just pick up on Councillor Lowe's point. Already, 20% of Victorians have voted in Saturday's election. And those numbers may even be higher, maybe to 25%. So I guess that shows how the electorate is changing with respect to their voting methods. And so that's a combination of in-person and postal. Of course, they look for the opportunity to vote when they can. Now, whether that gets reflected in local government or not, quite rightly the decision to go attendance or postal resides with the council, quite rightly.